Previously on Get In The Mecha. The first arc kind of depends a lot on this encounter, this confrontational encounter being the sharp Hitagi that's all up in Araragi's business. And it is a lot more, it is at a much slower pace, and it still has a very simple structure. These aren't bad things particularly, it just means that it isn't very memorable, but it does set the precedent for a lot of things going forward. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode we are looking at the Suruga Monkey Arc of Bakemonogatari and the Monogatari Series. Last time we looked at Bakemonogatari, we stopped off at the Mayui Maimai arc, and that was okay, and we got through quite a few things about that and what I liked about it. And in today's episode we are taking a step forward and looking at the next arc, which I'd say is a bit more fast-paced, or just a lot more fast-paced generally. And so in today's episode what I want to do is talk about, of course, this arc, what it entails, and even talk of a few technical things as well. I want to talk about the changes in board or storyboarders for these episodes, as well as a bit about the animation of this arc as well, because there are some pretty notable parts which I want to get to. As always, if you do enjoy this podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you left it a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do get your podcasts. And then if you could like and subscribe on YouTube and even leave a comment, that would be greatly appreciated. We're almost at 100 subscribers as well, so that would be super cool if you could actually subscribe. But let's not waste any more time. Here is the podcast for this week. That is episode 85 of Get In The Mecha, a look at the Suruga Monkey Arc of Bakemonogatari. As always, the way I like to start these episodes is to give you a bit of a alert in case there are any spoilers. And if you came here, most likely you knew that there would be spoilers for the Suruga Monkey Arc of Bakemonogatari, and that's what I'm here to tell you basically. There will be open discussion about the plot. How much detail I'll be going into it is variable, but I would recommend watching this before you listen to this episode. It would be really cool as well, even though I've obviously already watched it, but if there's someone out there who hasn't watched it, it'd be really cool to watch along while listening to these. I know you'll probably have to wait quite a while for more of them to come out because I don't do Bakemonogatari analysis every week, but it'd be super awesome if you were to listen along while also watching the show as well. So if anyone does do that, then please tell me, do at me on Twitter or something like that. My social media links are always in the description, but yeah, or please tell me if you do that, because that'll be really cool to see if you could watch it and then listen to the analysis and see if the two actually work or enhance the viewing experience. But moving on from that, I'm going to jump right into a plot summary for the Suruga Monkey Arc. Despite all the challenges that Araragi has faced recently and so far, dealing with apparitions and such, he is still a school kid and he still does have exams. Therefore, he decides to study at Hitagi Senjogaharu's place. We know she is very smart, she's very intellectual, and she will be a great tutor for him, so he decides to go to her house. On the way there, he actually encounters a girl that goes to his school. They end up engaging in a conversation, and most importantly, her name is Kanburu Suruga. Araragi and Hitagi engage for quite a while in this study session. However, things all start to change when he goes home, since when he is on his way home, he encounters a mysterious figure that decides to attack him. This figure is in a raincoat and also has a monkey's paw. Where this gets really interesting though is that we discover that this very person who attacked him is the girl which he met on the way to Hitagi's house, Kanburu Suruga. It turns out that she's actually been possessed by an apparition and she can't really remember when she goes on these rampages. This is a really brutal arc in the series, since it puts Araragi to the test, since he has no other option to solve this problem of the apparition without using force. So that is the plot summary for this arc, and I have to say that when I look back at it now, since I'm basically rewatching the series as I'm doing these episodes, looking back at it now, it doesn't seem as structurally complex. I think that's because I've gone very used to how Monogatari or the Monogatari series is structured, and how some of these boards tackle the events of the series, and so it feels very manageable as opposed to before, where it was very hard to digest always what was going on because it was simply just a bit complicated and not like anything I'd really seen before. That being said, although it is rather easy to grasp personally when it comes to this arc, at least on the structural level, that isn't to say that it isn't very different to what we've experienced. Yes, we do have the meeting a person, encountering the apparition, and then having to solve the problem, but this comes at a very different order, because usually it's that we find the apparition and we solve the problem, and we still are solving the problem here, but it's more like the problem has come to us, and we are forced to solve it because it's attacked us. The apparition poses much more of a danger this time, as opposed to, sort of coming out of the sky, quite literally, as we had with Senju Gahara meeting Mayoi at the park. It's a very different situation here, and I think we have to look at this arc quite differently in comparison to the other two. So in terms of direction and storyboarding, we have quite a few changes, or a very big change within this. Firstly, I'm just going to go through the storyboarders and episode directors for these episodes, and then I'll point out what's the really big thing to take note of. So in part 1, we have storyboards from Michio Fukuda and Tatsuya Oishi, and episode direction by Jun Fukuda and Toshimasa Suzuki. In part 2, we have storyboards solely from Oishi, and then episode direction from Tomoyuki Itamura and Suzuki from last episode. And then in part 3, the final part, we have storyboards from Oishi and Fukuda again, and then episode direction from Itamura, Suzuki, and Oishi. I know I just threw out quite a lot of names there, so feel free to rewind, or just, it's not so important to remember the very order. But the big shift I really want you to take note of is that Nobuyuki Takeuchi has switched out as storyboarding for a lot of these episodes, and that has switched to Oishi and also Fukuda as well. So Takeuchi's kind of taken a bit of a step back here. And I think that we'll see quite a few visual differences, but also something I really like about Oishi is that I personally, this is a very personal opinion, I think that he handles action very well. I think it's very good to have Oishi boarding because he really gets action. And we'll eventually explore this more as we progress through the series too. As I was saying before, this is a very tonally different arc to the past two arcs which have been in the series. The Monogatari series has always, and it's kind of at the heart of its identity, it's always been about solving problems through language and dialogue. It already deals quite heavily with the complexities of language and stuff like that, but the Suruga Monkey Arc takes a very different route in how we're almost forced into the arc. I think the series has been quite comfortable so far, and I'm potentially saying that because of my own bias, since I've watched this series and I get how it's composed. But even so, I think it's a great arc for taking us out of this very comforted Monogatari series, if you can call it that, where the apparition makes its way into the narrative, and then we learn to fix the problem. And it's not to say that there aren't problems in the way, but it's a lot more convenient as opposed to the Suruga Monkey Arc, which is pretty much an inconvenience. We're forced to solve this issue as we're pretty much attacked by Suruga. Just to build on that, I really like how this time we're met with violence and threats, which isn't really a side of apparitions we've seen. We've already seen them in terms of mental torment and stuff like that with the issues which Hitagi was facing, and that is equally as stressful, but seeing a sort of physical manifestation and physical threat is something we're completely new to. And I think this is where the show starts to spin the notion of the apparition on its head quite a bit. So the nature of apparitions and our understanding of how they are and how they work is really changing within this arc. I know that I said that I was going to try and avoid using hindsight in this series, and I still am going to, for the sake of being fair and just giving a bit more of a genuine representation of what I think about the series, besides just bringing up things that happened in the future. But I'm going to briefly transport you to my Cinema of Humanity episode where I kind of spoke about Kizumonogatari quite a lot. And what came up then was this notion of us being emotional beings and how this series really tries to bring out what human nature is all about. And I feel like personally this is the arc where I start to really catch on to this subtext. The other two, yes, are still about who we are as people and how the surrealist aesthetic really does still manage to latch on to the subconscious and all these things. That still stands, but I think that it becomes really apparent here. We'll kind of talk about it from the perspective of animation as well. But this series has always been kind of fixated on being rational. But now we're really starting to see the very emotional and almost feral perspective of a lot of these characters, be it Araragi and Suruga towards the end of the arc where they have this massive fight. It ends up being very rage-driven and driven by feelings and passions and fear. And that is where I think this starts to overtake a lot of what the series has been communicating for the past few episodes. While we're on the topic of surrealism and the aesthetic, I think it's a perfect time to now talk about the boards of Oishi and Fukuda. These are, I'm more familiar with Oishi than I am Fukuda, so I'm mostly going to be referring to this as Oishi, and also because Oishi is kind of the main director of the series as well, I'm mostly going to be emphasizing him, but that isn't to say that Fukuda isn't of the same importance. But I would say there's quite a difference between the storyboards of Nobuyuki Takeuchi, who does do some great boards, but we compare that to Oishi and Fukuda's, and it tells a very different story, or I would say that Oishi and Fukuda, take a lot more liberties in their approach, personally. And I am a very big fan of this. I think when we have a series that tries to explore the very deep and unconscious nature of who we are as beings and what it really means to be human, this is what we need. We need these liberties. We need this very abstract. I really don't like using the term abstract because it gets very misused, but I just mean, when I say abstract, I just mean this very nonsensical type of imagery, things that we can't immediately associate with the other thing, because that is the whole point of the subconscious. We're not really supposed to understand it and rationalize it so much. It's the fact that it is irrational, and I think Oishi and Fukuda really take advantage of this. Of course, when we're talking about storyboarding, it's perfect to come up with actual examples of these liberties, and so I have two really nice ones which I really enjoyed from these 3 episodes. One of them is the use of real-life photography. This is something which has already existed within the series, and this isn't exclusive to Oishi particularly, Oishi and Fukuda, but I have really enjoyed how they have used it and implemented it. At the very beginning of this arc, immediately we have monkey imagery, real life monkey imagery, and we hear them and their noises and everything. It's really just to assimilate us into what this arc is all about. It connects the very logical thing to the name and the word to unite it into monkey, and I really do like that sort of choice there. This one's also very small, but it's to do with live action photography again. It's when Hitagi is speaking to Araragi, they're at the table studying, and then I think for some reason she puts, it's either a pen or a flashlight towards his eye, and then we switch, and it looks so much more visceral, and I think that's the point. We often associate things which are coming to someone's eye as dangerous immediately, and it puts it right into that situation without us actually having to just generate that image in our mind. It's almost as if Oishi and Fukuda use what they're thinking and bring it into the episode. And then my final example of just how awesome these storyboards are, there's one scene where on the way, I think it's on the way back, I'm pretty sure it's on the way back home for Araragi, and then he's talking to Hanekawa on the phone, and instead of having this normal two-way conversation where we would switch, and this is sort of typical film 101, often you would switch from one person to another, or if not, you would hear the person through the phone, and it's not like we don't do that, but I really like Oishi's approach to it in how, if I'm not wrong, this is episode 2, if not it's episode 1, so Oishi Fukuda, sorry I keep making that mistake, but what they do is that when they're on the phone, we almost switch almost entirely to Hanekawa's perspective. And then every time we want to hear Araragi, we end up switching to an almost not plain background, but just a random part in the town. And we hear his voice and we have subtitles for his voice too. And I like that. It's a switch to Hanekawa's perspective, as if it's only her speaking to the person she can't see on the phone. And generally, this is just what I love about this arc. It takes a lot of liberties aesthetically, and it's really just what makes this series just a bit more exciting to watch, even when it is very dialogue heavy. Even when we're not at the action itself, which I'm going to get to, but even when we aren't within the action and at the very big parts which will change the tide and course of this arc or these few episodes, it's very nice to see that there is still a lot of effort put into how we portray these characters throughout, be it just talking on the phone or actually fighting. It shows a lot of effort and dedication to try and keep up this subtext and to really maintain it throughout almost every conversation and every moment possible, and not just these quote-unquote peaks or game-changing moments. I don't think for a lot of the imagery, they really need explaining. I did kind of move to explaining them. I'm a bit guilty of that, but I don't think that all of them you're really able to pin down to a very specific thing or why they're doing them. I think generally that's sort of the purpose of this series. Not everything can be explained, just like how apparitions can't really be explained, and there's not too much effort to say why there are apparitions around. They kind of just are around. They play on our feelings and emotions, but besides that, there isn't this origin story, and I really do like that, and it's the same with its aesthetic as well. For the remainder of this episode, I want to now talk about the action. I'm not going to get too into it. We're not going to do a whole animation analysis. We unfortunately don't have time for that. Although I'd be happy to do a Monogatari Series action animation analysis, because I know you guys did enjoy the Wonder Egg Priority one, and I know that yes, that might just be because it's recent and it's quite popular right now, but I really would enjoy doing something very specific for the Monogatari series in action, because there's some really good stuff in this series that I'd love to point out and break down a bit more. However, in the case of the action of the Suruga Monkey Arc, the best way to describe it is brutal. And I was about to try and put another descriptor to that, but I just realized nothing can really top brutal. That is, in essence, what it is and what it tries to prove as well. That these apparitions aren't always going to allow you to solve the problem so easily. And this arc again brings in this concept of resistance. And it's not something that's explained or something like that, but this is just an idea that is emerging kind of towards the middle of the series, and this is where things really begin to change. There was honestly a time where I didn't care about animation that much. I really got into animation and animation analysis about a year and a half ago or something like that. And now I'm really into it. I'm able to see things that I didn't really think I could see. And I don't mean that in a bragging way. I just more mean it as in the things which I'm more likely to point out or get more excited over because I, say, know who animated whatever scene, or it just excites me a lot more. But even so, prior to when I was really into this sort of animation analysis stuff, this fight always stood out to me, and I think what was great about this even prior was how raw it was and how brutal, as I said, it really has been. I can't talk about every animator that touched this arc, but at least for this action section, I want to highlight two very specific animators who I think do kind of similar things, but in a way quite differently. I'll kind of dive into that a bit more. And these two animators are Hironori Tanaka and Genichiro Abe. Tanaka is already pretty famous as an animator. If you are talking about animation and Japanese animation today, Tanaka is bound to come up somewhere. A very recognizable animator when you know what they do, because they exude these almost everywhere when they are in a production. And then Genichiro Abe is very famous relative to Shaft, and they also have very famous cuts from anime like Monogatari as well. Tanaka, as I have mentioned on this podcast and in countless Twitter threads, is very focused upon hair and fabric and such, and they are very good at animating this. They are a master at distorting hair and showing us that it isn't simply this unitary entity or this almost, I don't really know how to describe it, but it's not a whole entity. Often hair is animated as one thing, or it looks like one thing in anime, but Tanaka's able to take it apart and show that it is made of individual strands, and fabric, it can also be bent and torn and taken in loads of different directions depending on where the subject is moving. To me, this is really what the series needed to bring out this idea that apparitions will resist, and the fight, I say that in quotation marks, the fight against the apparitions will not be an easy one. And we see that not only through how Suruga is animated during this fight, but how Araragi is animated too, and the way he's struggling, and he's just a mess within it. And then, as I said before, we have Genichiro Abe as well, and I would say Abe is very good with their shape work. Tanaka focuses a lot on form, and that isn't to say that Abe doesn't focus on form. Everyone focuses on form as an animator, of course, but I mean that a lot of how they express pain and these very struggle type emotions for Abe comes through their shape, and they're very good at pointing shapes, so they focus a lot on the hairs and fibers of Suruga on the tips of the monkey, as well as the hairs, I don't know to call it hairs, but fibers of the rope as well. In terms of the rope, this makes it look very constrained. It just adds to this much more tense feeling that we're in a fight, of course. And for the hairs or fibers of the monkey, or fur, I think that's a better term. If monkeys have fur, anyway, I think that just creates a lot more of an antagonistic look, because a lot of the time they are pointing outwards and they are facing Araragi. So I think that just adds to this much more confrontational approach, which this arc seems to have as an entire theme, really. And then just one final point that isn't really animator specific, but I just love how this fight is composed and the approach to how the characters move generally. I suppose we can thank Oishi for this, as well as Fukuda, but I am obsessed with how we either go for the extreme close-up on the eye, or we're quite far away. We're never really at a very close and very warm angle. I just feel like it's always been a bit uncomfortable, and that's a good thing. That's part of what this series is all about. But I'm very surprised how we got these much more intimate shots within a fight, which is kind of very reversed for the Monogatari series, how we get very close to Araragi at some point, where it's not an extreme close-up. We're not just focusing in on his eye, but we're seeing his hair and his head at this upwards angle and stuff like that. So another thing, is how the characters move as well, specifically Gamburu, and she weaves around. There's obviously a sense of experience there. Yes, it's a sort of feral attack, but it also has strategy and skill to it, and it just adds to this thing that I've been repeating throughout the episode, that this is one about resistance and difficulty. The bar has been raised here, and through these movements and these animation, we get a sense that this isn't going to be an easy apparition to deal with, and dealing with apparitions was never an easy task to begin with. With all of that, that is the analysis for this week. I don't think I can extend that any longer. It all roots back to this same idea, which I'm going to eventually come back to. So let's just go to closing thoughts and wrap up the podcast for this week. And I will give you my general opinion and final take on the Suruga Monkey Arc. The Suruga Monkey Arc is a turning point in the Monogatari series. We've felt, or I personally have felt very comfortable watching the past 5 episodes, and although they've been amazing, they're still very good episodes of anime nonetheless, but Suruga Monkey really tries to shake the boat and rock the boat a bit by creating this very confrontational and very surprising atmosphere. Instead of us meeting the apparition comes to us, and we're forced to deal with it using any means necessary. This is also met by some structural changes, and by structural changes I more mean stuff behind the scenes, so Oishi switching into boards as well as Fukuda as well, and I think as a result we get a much more daring 3 episodes as opposed to Takeuchi's previous episodes. I still love Takeuchi's approach, but I think that the switch to Oishi and Fukuda was what was needed for these few episodes to bring out the very emotional side of the Monogatari series, which involves the subconscious and desire and also anger as well, these things which we don't really think about or on a surface level, but are much deeper things. We needed storyboarders who can really tap into this type of imagery pretty well, and I think that they were the perfect choice to do this. And then when we get to the actual fighting animation itself, it's also a massive treat. I constantly felt on edge watching this, and I don't think I can really get back that feeling from the first time in how it was absolutely brutal and I didn't see it coming. And I think that thought really encapsulates what I think about this arc. You don't really see it coming until it's there, and I think you really have to savor these three episodes because they're a massive rejig of what the Monogatari series is and how it's going to progress going forwards. Thank you for listening to this episode of Get In The Mecha. That has been episode 85. I hope you did enjoy this episode. It's pretty hard to dive right into this arc, but I tried my best and I did enjoy doing this episode quite a lot. I love talking about the Monogatari series, so it wasn't really a difficult thing to do. It's just about composing myself, which can get a bit challenging, but I hope you did enjoy this episode. If you want to follow me outside of the podcast, I've forgotten to promote my Twitter recently, but if you want to follow me outside of the podcast, you can do so on Twitter. That's where I'm most active outside of this thing, as well as the articles I write. But if you want to do so, then be sure to check that out. That will be in the description for the podcast, either on YouTube and on the RSS feed too. If you want to support the podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That would be the best thing you could do. I'm highly encouraging you to do so. That would help me a ton, and it helps grow the listener base of this podcast too. Then you can do things to support the show on YouTube if that's where you listen. You can subscribe. We are almost at 100 subscribers, so that would mean the world right now. If you can subscribe on YouTube, if you could leave a like on the video, if you leave a comment, be it a critique, something you enjoyed, any of it, even if you're just saying hi, I will say hi back. It's very nice to have people commenting, and it means a lot because it's how I improve the podcast, and it's also how the algorithm manages to find us somehow too. So those things could be very helpful if you could do that on YouTube. And then finally, if you could just tell one friend about this podcast, be it online. In fact, I encourage you to do it online. online, or at least some way that isn't contact based. But if you could tell someone about this podcast, that would be really nice, not just for me but for them as well, as that gives them a podcast to listen to. So that is it. Have a great rest of your week, and have a great weekend too. These episodes have been coming out late, but I am still trying to get them ready for you to start your weekend off with, and I'm still going to try and stick to that goal. Thank you for listening. I have been your host Shmar today. Stay safe, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Jazz by Alex McCulloch, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, Difference by Chasers Gaming, and Anomaly by Eric Medias under soundimage.org.